She raised the Duke's hair in a fishing village for 11 years. The boy's birthmark made denial impossible. The boy had his father's hands. Not similar, not vaguely reminiscent in the way that children sometimes echo the faces of strangers. Thomas Holloway had the exact wide-knuckled, long-fingered, deliberately careful hands that appeared in every Whitmore portrait dating back to 1603, rendered in oil paint with the patient attention of artists who understood that the Whitmore hands were, in their particular family, a kind of signature. He was 10 years old, and he was mending a lobster pot on the Torkham Harbour wall because Mr. Ede the fisherman had given him a penny to do it, and he had calculated that 3 pennies would purchase the volume of Euclid, that the lending library did not stock. He worked with the focused, unhurried attention of a child who has never needed to perform industry, because industry is simply what he does. At his left shoulder, visible above the rough collar of his fishing shirt, because the morning was warm and he had rolled his sleeves and opened his collar without thinking about it, as boys of 10 do on warm mornings, was a birthmark, crescent-shaped, dark against fair skin, positioned at the precise angle that appeared in every Whitmore family record, including the physician's notes from Gabriel Whitmore's own birth, filed in the Ravenshire Estate Archive under the heading, Distinguishing Marks of the Male Heir. A woman passing on the harbour lane above stopped walking. She had a basket of accounts to deliver to the chandler. She had been walking this harbour lane for 10 years. She had never before seen the Duke of Ravenshire's estate steward standing at the top of the steps, looking down at the boy on the wall. But Lionel Whitmore was there now, and he had seen the birthmark. Thomas had not looked up. He did not know yet what had just changed. Hey, quick question. Have you ever had to protect someone you love by keeping a secret that cost you everything? Not for yourself, for them. Tell us where you're watching from, and if you believe the truth always finds its way out eventually. Subscribe, because this boy's birthmark just started a clock. Ravenshire Castle on the North Devonshire coast was the kind of house that expected things of people, expected silence in its corridors, correctness at its table, and the particular quality of emotional restraint that its current duke had elevated, in 10 years of widowed administration, to something approaching architectural principle. Gabriel Whitmore was 38 years old and had managed his estate, his tenants, his parliamentary obligations, and his grief with identical precision. He was fair-haired, where most Whitmore men ran dark, broad-shouldered, with the steady grey eyes of his maternal line and the hands, those deliberate, wide-knuckled hands, of every Whitmore male since the 16th century. He was considered, in the county's measured assessment, just. He did not consider himself just. He considered himself functional. There was a distinction, and he lived in it. 9 miles south, in the village of Torkham-on-Sea, Beatrice Holloway was at the harbour master's desk at 5:30 in the morning, correcting an error in the tide ledger that would have sent 2 fishing boats out on the wrong schedule and cost their crews a day's catch. She was 30 years old, dark-haired, composed in the specific way of a woman who has made composure a daily discipline rather than a natural state. She kept the harbour accounts. She tutored the vicar's daughters in French. She was, in Torkham's collective opinion, indispensable and slightly unknowable. Thomas was still asleep upstairs. He slept, as he always slept, with one arm thrown over the edge of the narrow bed and his left shoulder turned upward. The birthmark visible, as it always was, to anyone who entered the room. Beatrice had spent 10 years ensuring that the wrong person never did. She had not, until this morning, considered that the wrong person might come from the seaside of the village, rather than the road. Beatrice saw the steward's face before he saw hers. That was the only reason she had time to prepare it. Lionel Whitmore was 54 years old, lean as February and possessed of the particular quality of attention that belongs to men who have spent decades managing other people's assets, and understand that information is its own form of currency. He had come to Torquem on estate business, a disputed fishing rights claim that touched the Ravenshire coastal boundary, and had no reasons, and by any logic Beatrice had constructed, to be standing at the harbour wall at 7 in the morning. She set down the tide ledger. She picked up her shawl. She walked toward the harbour steps at the pace of a woman with somewhere to be, which she was. Thomas was on the wall below. She needed to reach him before Lionel turned from the steps. She did not run. Running announces itself. She walked with the focused, unhurried momentum of a woman who has learned that panic is a luxury she cannot afford, and she reached the bottom of the steps and put her hand on Thomas's shoulder. Gently, ordinarily, the hand of a mother redirecting a child, and said quietly that Mr. Ede would not need the pot until Thursday, and they had bread to collect from Mrs. Fenn. Thomas looked up at her with 10-year-old assessment. "I've nearly finished." "Thursday," Beatrice said. Something in her voice reached him. He set the pot down. They walked up the steps together, Thomas pulling his collar straight as he climbed, and Beatrice did not look at Lionel Whitmore as they passed him at the top. And she did not let her pace change by a single beat, and she did not release Thomas's shoulder until they had turned the corner into the main street. Then she stopped. She stood in the shadow of the chandler's doorway and counted her own heartbeats until they were even. In her workbox at the cottage, beneath the account ledgers, was a document she had not looked at in 3 years. She thought she had better look at it today. The Duke's carriage arrived on a Wednesday. Beatrice knew before she saw it, knew from the way Mrs. Fenn went quiet at the bakery window, and the way the harbour master straightened his coat for no apparent reason, that something from the world she had left had arrived in the world she had built. She was at the schoolroom table with the vicar's daughters when Thomas came in from the lending library and stopped in the doorway with his coat half-buttoned and a book under his arm, and said, with the particular neutrality of a child reporting a fact, "There is a very large carriage at the top of the main street. The crest on the door is a raven on a grey field." The vicar's eldest daughter looked up. "That is the Ravenshire Arms." "Yes," said Thomas. He looked at his mother. "Isn't it?" It was not a question. Beatrice closed the grammar she was holding with the measured deliberateness of a woman performing a domestic action rather than buying herself 4 seconds. "Finish your chapter," she told the girls. She looked at Thomas. "Come with me." They stood at the cottage window together and watched Gabriel Whitmore descend from the carriage with the economic, unhurried movement of a man entirely at home in his own authority. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps she had simply spent 10 years reducing him in her mind to a manageable size. He did not look toward the cottage. He had no reason to know it existed. He was speaking with the harbour master, who was gesturing toward the coastal boundary, the estate business that had brought him, nothing more. Thomas stood beside her, with his book closed and his left hand resting on the windowsill, the rolled sleeve showing the birthmark clearly against the afternoon light. Beatrice put her own hand over his, gently, as though adjusting his position. Gabriel Whitmore looked up from the harbour master's map at precisely that moment, and for reasons he could not account for, his gaze moved to the cottage window before moving away. He saw the boy on the Thursday. It was accidental in the technical sense. Gabriel was walking the coastal boundary with the harbour master's surveyor, a dull and necessary exercise, when the path crossed the main street, and a child came out of the lending library at the precise moment. Gabriel passed the door. They nearly collided. The boy stepped back with the automatic courtesy of a child well raised and said, "I beg your pardon, sir," in a voice entirely composed for 10 years old, and then looked up. Gabriel looked down. The child had a book, Euclid, of all things, held in both hands, and the hands themselves were what arrested Gabriel first, before the face, before anything else. Wide-knuckled, long-fingered, the thumb placed with a particular deliberate care along the spine of the book. His own hands, in miniature. "What are you reading?" Gabriel heard himself say. It was not what he had intended to say. He had not intended to say anything. The elements, the boy's grey eyes. And they were grey, a specific grey, the grey of the Whitmore maternal line, assessed him within the unconcerned directness of a child who does not yet understand that certain assessments are considered impolite. Book 5. The Theory of Proportion. It is more interesting than it sounds. "I know," Gabriel said. The boy looked at him with a fractional increase of attention. "You've read it?" 3 times. A pause. The boy considered this with visible fairness. "Then you know the 5th proposition is the most elegant. I always preferred the 7th. The boy's chin set at an angle that Gabriel could not explain and did not examine. "I can see why," the boy allowed. "But you are wrong." He nodded politely and went on his way. Gabriel stood in the street outside the lending library and looked at his own hands. He had not slept well since Tuesday. He understood, standing on the Torkham Main Street in the October afternoon, that he was not going to sleep well tonight either, and that the reason had nothing to do with the coastal boundary dispute. Beatrice had told no one the full story. She had told the Torkham clergyman, Mr. Ames, the essential facts in October of 1848, because she had needed a witness, and he had been the only person within walking distance. She trusted to write something down and keep it. She had told Thomas when he was 7, and asked why he had no father. A version of the truth calibrated for 7 years old, that his father was a duke who had believed something false, and that, when he was older, she would tell him the rest. Thomas had received this information with 7-year-old equanimity and asked if dukes were required to believe false things, or if it was a choice. She had told him it was a choice. He had said nothing further on the subject for 3 years. She knew, with the knowledge of a mother who has watched a child process information, that he had been thinking about it ever since. The injustice itself she had replayed in the specific, involuntary way of trauma, not as narrative but as sensation. The smell of the Ravenshire study. The sound of Lionel's voice, measured and regretful, explaining to Gabriel what he claimed to have discovered, the letter Lionel had produced. Her handwriting, her signature, addressed to a man in Bristol, she had met precisely once at a county assembly. The way Gabriel had not shouted, the way the silence had been worse than shouting. She had been 2 months pregnant, she had told him. He had looked at her with an expression that she had spent 10 years trying not to see in the dark. Now she sat across from Mr. Ames in his cold parlour, with the witnessed document between them on the table, and explained, calmly, that the Duke of Ravenshire was in Torkham, that his estate steward had seen Thomas, and that she needed to know whether the document would hold. Mr. Ames looked at the document. He looked at her. "It will hold," he said. "But Beatrice, he has seen Thomas. And I think you already know what that means." The solicitor's name was Harriet Vane. Beatrice had found her through the vicar's wife, who had used her for a property dispute 3 years prior, and described her as the most relentlessly precise person she had ever encountered, which was exactly what Beatrice required. Miss Vane was 41, angular, and received the full account of the injustice with the focused attention of a woman taking a deposition, rather than hearing a confession. "The letter Lionel produced," she said when Beatrice finished. "You denied authorship immediately?" "Immediately, and specifically. The signature was close, but the date notation was wrong. I always write the day before the month. The letter reversed them. Miss Vane wrote something, and the man it was addressed to. I had spoken to him twice, at a county assembly. He was a wool merchant from Bristol. I did not know his address and would have had no means of obtaining it. Lionel obtained it." Miss Vane set down her pen with the measured click of a woman arriving at a conclusion. "He would have needed a sample of your genuine handwriting to work from." Your correspondence passed through the Ravenshire post? All of it. Then the forgery was constructed from letters already in the estate's possession. She paused. Mrs. Holloway, I want to look at the Ravenshire auxiliary accounts for 1847 and 1848. Lionel was estate steward. He managed those accounts. A commission of the kind he would have needed to pay a skilled forger leaves a record. Not always an obvious one, but a record. She looked at Beatrice with the direct, undecorated attention of a professional who has decided to spend her skill on a case that matters. There is one more thing. She opened a folder. A letter arrived at my office yesterday from a retired Ravenshire housemaid named Dorothy Crisp, who heard I was making inquiries. She says she witnessed Lionel burning correspondence in the estate office in November 1848. She kept a fragment. She placed it on the table. Beatrice's own handwriting, half a sentence, one word visible, innocent. Thomas had known since he was 8. Not the details. Not the forged letter, or the name of the steward, or the specific architecture of the lie. But the essential fact. The Duke of Ravenshire was his father. His mother had been wrongly expelled, and she had not told him the whole truth at 7. Because she was protecting him from something she was not yet certain was over. He had deduced this from the following evidence. His mother's handwriting, which he had studied since he could read, bore no resemblance to the notation style she used when stressed. The day-before-month date system she employed in the harbour accounts, which he had observed, was consistent across every document she had ever written. The Ravenshire Arms in his history book of Devonshire families, which he had looked at for a long time the first time he found it, and the hands of the man he had spoken to outside the lending library, which were his own hands at 38 years old. He had not told his mother, he knew. She was managing something difficult, and he understood, with the equanimity of a child raised by a precise woman, that adding to her difficulty served neither of them. He was, however, keeping a record. In the back of his Euclid, the last 3 pages, in his smallest handwriting, he had noted every relevant fact in the order he had established it, with a column for confirmed, and a column for probable, and a column for unknown. The unknown column had one entry remaining, whether father knows I exist. After the encounter outside the library, he moved it to confirmed. He turned to the back pages that evening while his mother thought he was asleep, and in the confirmed column, in his careful hand, he wrote, "He has read Euclid 3 times. He preferred Proposition 7. He was wrong, but for understandable reasons. He did not know who I was, but his hands went still when he saw mine. He knows something. He does not yet know what." Lionel Whitmore had not spent 10 years managing the Ravenshire estate without understanding that information requires active maintenance. The letter arrived at Miss Vane's office on a Friday morning, not from Lionel directly, which would have been too obvious, but from a London solicitor retained by the Ravenshire estate, informing Miss Vane that any claim pertaining to the Ravenshire succession made on behalf of an illegitimate child would be contested on the grounds of an existing signed declaration. Miss Vane read it twice. She sent for Beatrice. The declaration, attached as a copy, bore Beatrice's signature, dated November 1848. It stated in precise legal language that she acknowledged the child she carried was not of the Duke's issue and relinquished all claim on his estate or title. Beatrice read it at Miss Vane's desk and felt the room reorganize itself around her in the specific, airless way of encountering something that should not exist. "I did not sign this," she said. "I know." Miss Vane's voice was even. "The date notation puts the day after the month." The forgery was precise, the signature convincing, and it had clearly been sitting in a Ravenshire legal file for 10 years, waiting. Beatrice set the document down with hands that she required, by an act of concentrated will to remain steady. This was the thing she had not anticipated. Not the watching, not the estate solicitor, not even the speed of Lionel's response. The declaration. 10 years old, Signed and filed, and waiting like a trap, she had walked toward without knowing the ground was prepared. The composure she had maintained for a decade cracked. One moment, one breath, 1 second where 10 years of daily cost crossed her face without permission. Then she closed it. The date notation, she said. Can you demonstrate the pattern across every document I have ever produced? I already have, said Miss Vane. Then we go to Gabriel Whitmore directly, before Lionel does. She came to Ravenshire on a Saturday morning, without announcement. Miss Vane had advised against it. Beatrice had listened carefully and gone anyway, because there are moments when the correct strategic decision and the only bearable human decision are different things, and she had been making the correct strategic decision for 10 years. The housekeeper brought her to the estate office without asking twice. Something in Beatrice's manner, perhaps. The quality of a woman who has walked through those doors before and knows exactly which corridor leads where. Gabriel was at his desk. He stood when she entered, not from surprise, from the automatic courtesy of a man correctly raised, and then the courtesy dropped out of his face entirely as recognition arrived, and for one unguarded moment he was 38 years old and 28 years. Old simultaneously, standing in the same room with the same woman, and 10 years of a mistake between them. Beatrice, he said. She had prepared for many things. She had not prepared for the way her own name in his voice would land after 10 years of not hearing it. Sit down, she said. I have something to show you. She placed Miss Vane's documents on the desk in order. The witnessed account from Mr. Ames, the Dorothy Crisp fragment with her handwriting. The auxiliary account record Miss Vane had obtained, a payment in September 1847 to an address in Exeter in Lionel's hand. The forged declaration with its reversed date notation beside a page from the harbour accounts in Beatrice's consistent style. Gabriel looked at each document for a long time. He did not speak until the last one. The declaration, he said. Lionel showed me this in 1848. His voice was entirely level. It cost him something she could see in the jaw. I believed it. I know. I should not have. No, she said. You should not have. The silence between them held 10 years and a child's grey eyes and the specific weight of a mistake that cannot be unmade, only carried differently. His name is Thomas, she said. He is 10 years old. He has read Euclid 3 times, and he already knows who you are. The estate accounts hearing was held in Exeter before a magistrate on a Tuesday in November. Lionel Whitmore arrived expecting a private financial review. He found Miss Vane, the full documentation, Dorothy Crisp in person, and Gabriel Whitmore seated at the table with the expression of a man who has spent 4 days reading 10 years of auxiliary account records, and arrived at a number. Beatrice presented the evidence herself. She had insisted on this. Miss Vane had offered to lead. Gabriel had offered to speak. Beatrice had declined, both with the particular politeness of a woman who has been waiting 10 years to lay something on a table in front of witnesses and intends to do it herself. She placed the documents in order. She stated the facts in the sequence they had occurred. She explained the date notation discrepancy across 37 samples of her genuine handwriting against the 2 forged documents. She read Dorothy Crisp's account of the burning correspondence. She identified the Exeter payment in Lionel's hand and named the recipient. A document forger whose second conviction had been recorded in the Devon, assizes 3 years prior. Lionel said she was a woman of no standing, making claims against an estate trustee of impeccable reputation. Gabriel placed one additional document on the table at this point, independently, without consultation, at the visible cost of whatever relationship had remained between himself and his uncle's family. It was a record from the Ravenshire physician's files. Thomas's birthmark, described in precise clinical language, matching the Whitmore male heir notation that appeared in the estate's own medical records, dating to 1761. He had found it himself. At 2 in the morning, alone in the archive, the magistrate looked at Lionel Whitmore for a long time. "I think," he said, "we have heard sufficient." Gabriel came to Torcombe on the Thursday. He came without the carriage, on a hired horse, in a plain coat, because arriving in the full Ravenshire presentation at the door of a whitewashed cottage on a harbour lane seemed to him the wrong kind of claim to make on a place that had never been his and a child who owed him nothing. Beatrice opened the door. She looked at him with the full, clear, undecorated attention of a woman who has stopped managing how she appears to this particular man. "He is in the sitting-room," she said. Thomas was at the table with his Euclid and his notebook open to the last 3 pages. He looked up when Gabriel entered with the assessing, patient attention of a boy who has been preparing for this conversation since he was 8 years old, and has several questions in a specific order. "I know what happened," Thomas said. "I worked most of it out myself. Mama confirmed the rest last Tuesday." "I know," Gabriel said. "She told me. I have one question before anything else." Gabriel sat down across from him, not invited, not uninvited, and waited. "Did you look for us?" Thomas said. "After. Did you look?" The question landed with the precise, devastating simplicity of a true thing asked by someone too young to soften it. Gabriel held the boy's grey eyes. He did not look away. "No," he said. "I believed what I was shown. I did not question it. I did not look." He paused. "That is the thing I will not be able to give you back, whatever else I can offer. I cannot give you back the years when I should have looked and did not." Thomas considered this for a long moment, with the rigorous fairness he applied to everything. "Mama looked," Thomas said. "Every day. She made sure I was looked after." He closed the notebook. "I'm not ready to call you anything yet. I might be eventually. That is your decision entirely." "I know." Thomas opened the Euclid to Proposition 7. "Do you want to tell me why you preferred this one? I've been thinking about your reasoning, and I believe I can identify where you went wrong." Gabriel Whitmore looked at his son across the table and felt 10 years press against the inside of his chest like a tide that would not recede. He pulled his chair closer. "Show me," he said. "Torcombe, June 1860. The argument had been going for 20 minutes and showed no signs of resolution. Thomas's position, stated with the patient, implacable clarity he brought to all positions, was that the harbour account system required restructuring at the foundational level, and that implementing half measures would create compounding errors within 3 fiscal years. Gabriel's position was that the harbour master had managed the accounts adequately for 30 years, and that foundational restructuring required political negotiation that Thomas, at 11, was underestimating. Beatrice, at the writing desk by the window, was ostensibly reviewing the vicar's quarterly accounts. She was, in fact, watching her son and his father argue about harbour administration with the identical quality of focused, undecorated certainty and feeling something she did not have a word for, something adjacent to relief but larger and more complicated and less clean. Thomas had not called Gabriel father yet. He had begun in January, calling him by his given name, which was more than Gabriel had asked for, and more than Beatrice had expected. And Gabriel had received it with the careful, undemonstrative gratitude of a man who understands that everything he is given now is a gift and not a right. "The compounding error problem," Gabriel said, "is real, but you are assuming static variables." "Variables are never static," Thomas said. "That is precisely the point." Beatrice made a notation in the vicar's ledger that was slightly less precise than her usual standard. Gabriel looked at her across the room, a brief, unguarded look, the kind that had been happening with increasing frequency since March, and that she had not yet decided what to do about. She returned to the ledger. Outside, the June sea was the colour of possibility, and Thomas was already reaching for a piece of paper to demonstrate his point. And the afternoon was ordinary and earned, and entirely in probably whole hay. Before you go, this story was never really about a title or a birthmark or even a conspiracy. It was about a woman who decided her son deserved a whole life, and built him one, alone, with nothing but her precision and her refusal to disappear. If that kind of quiet, daily courage means something to you, tell us in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe, because the women in our next story are just as stubborn, and the truth they're carrying is just as heavy